Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the fascinating and controversial story of a new weapon that for the first time not only menaced the skies above the battlefield, but also the public at home. This is the story of Zeppelins in the First World War. Well, hello, Dan. Always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And today is in some ways, I suppose, a follow-on from an earlier episode we recorded, which covered the war in the air. And in that episode, we mainly looked at interaction between air forces over the Western Front. But of course, there were other aspects of the air war, including one that was very specific, and this was the use of Zeppelins during the First World War.
Yeah, hi, Spence. It's going to be, again, as always, I think a really fascinating subject to cover. One that I think is probably a little less popular. I don't know whether it's because it's typically away from the Western Front and maybe also gets covered, I think, overshadowed by things like the Blitz in the Second World War. But in truth, really, we're talking about the first Blitz. This is the Blitz a la 1915-16. So loads of stuff to cover. And Zeppelins have always held, I think, quite a powerful view in our mind, both in civilian and military terms. Of course, people famously think of things like the Hindenburg. But why don't we start off and just talk about a Zeppelin in general? Because Zeppelin's a little bit of a catch-all, actually, isn't it? It's not necessarily, we're not talking, Zeppelin's a bit like a Hoover compared to a vacuum. It's a brand name, really.
No, it is indeed, because a Zeppelin is actually named for its inventor, Ferdinand von Zeppelin, later to become Graf von Zeppelin, and his company, which made specifically Zeppelins. And what distinguished a Zeppelin from a balloon or an airship of this period is that it has a rigid metallic frame. And that rigid metallic frame is then covered in canvas, and inside that canvas bag is the hydrogen, which actually allows it to gain height. It's also got ballast in there that you can shed to gain height, or indeed control your altitude in various ways. And Zeppelins were being worked on by Zeppelin himself way back in the 1870s, and slowly but surely improved his designs and his technology. He patented them in the 1890s, and the Zeppelin design came of age really in the early 1900s. And it was considered a real technical marvel of the day. And in fact, it was such a technical marvel that although there were competing manufacturers in Germany, the catch-all phrase Zeppelin was also applied to their designs. And there was something uniquely Germanic about Zeppelins too. They'd been invented in that country, they'd been patented in that country, and they seem to express Germany's technological and industrial power in the early 1900s. And they, of course, actually come into service, or they start flying before the Wright brothers have completed their first powered flight. So these really are the cutting edge of aerial travel in the early 1900s. And they are a real technical wonder and a marvel, and they slowly develop over the 1900s. And indeed, on the eve of the First World War, the Germans actually have the world's first commercial airline that is operating Zeppelins to transport you around mainly Germany, but also some other parts of German-speaking Europe. And it's estimated that by the outbreak of the First World War, Zeppelins have actually carried about 10,000 paying passengers here, there, and everywhere, which is pretty remarkable when you consider there was no such thing as powered flight in the 1890s.
Yeah, it is, and slightly surprising. You know, everybody, when we talk about aerial history, I think, so history of aviation, very few people will look back and talk about Zeppelins. It's about the Wright brothers and the early flyers, and very much what we've done in this series so far, which is to cover that style of powered aircraft. But of course, Zeppelins predate that. And the idea of an airship generally, I think, is, when we think about all of the elements that we've covered in this series so far, it's no great surprise that when war comes along in 1914, that people are looking around and thinking, okay, well, what technology have we got, even in the civilian world, that we can actually adapt in order to make it a weapon of war? And one of the big things that is introduced by Zeppelins is quite simply range. You know, we're now talking about Zeppelins, airships being able to travel long distances and deliver, not an enormous payload, but deliver deadly weaponry to the enemy. And this can be done for the very first time way beyond the battlefield. In fact, on the home front. And this, I think, is why Zeppelins are going to take such an important place in the history of the public at home in the First World War, because the threat of Zeppelins actually not being for soldiers on the front line, but mothers in their kitchens back home is a really big one, and really shocks a hell of a lot of people.
It really does. And something that's, especially in Britain, is completely forgotten in the mists of time is this idea that Zeppelins might be used to attack civilians from the sky is very much a live and current one in the years before the First World War. Of course, tensions between Britain and Germany have been mounting throughout the 1900s due to the Anglo-German naval race. And in fact, the fear of the idea of a Zeppelin appearing over Britain and carrying out some form of attack, it captures the imagination of fiction writers. And it actually leads to a period of what we would probably call mass hysteria, actually, between 1909 and 1910, when dozens of British civilians are reporting seeing Zeppelins in the night sky. And there's actually no Zeppelins flying over Britain. This is a sort of mass hysteria, it's a panic. But it's a real phenomenon, and they get referred to as the ghost Zeppelins because they're ghostly and white. People are just imagining them, or perhaps they're just saying they've seen them so they can contribute to all this. But it's a very, very real phenomenon, and it captures the imagination of the newspapers, of the fiction writers. In fact, though, this sort of mass hysteria about unknown flying objects, it reminds me of the Gatwick airport drones incident of a few years ago in Britain, where a variety of people, including some quite serious people, policemen and so forth, absolutely swore blind that there was a drone operating above Gatwick Airfield in London. This was December 2018, and it actually closed the airfield for several days. It's now widely recognised this was a sort of mass hysteria about seeing a flying object. It doesn't actually exist. And in 1909, people were imagining seeing these Zeppelins, but that speaks also to the fear in 1909 about, well, what if a Zeppelin does attack? Now, there were no armed Zeppelins, there were no bomb-carrying Zeppelins before the First World War, but the Germans were well aware of their potential to serve in a military function, either as reconnaissance assets or as bomb-carrying machines. Bear in mind, listeners, that there's no aircraft that can carry a significant bomb payload in 1914, whereas a Zeppelin can. But just to emphasize how new the idea of an aerial attack is, bear in mind that in early 1914, the early part of the war, Zeppelins don't actually have a bomb. Instead, they drop artillery shells. They don't actually have a specific aerial weapon. They just go into the air carrying German 77mm artillery shells, just fuse them and drop them out the side. And it does us well to remind ourselves that in the 21st century, we are extremely familiar with air attacks in civilian areas. Sadly, we're living through a period in which we're watching it live on the television. We've lived through the Second World War with its mass aerial bombing. But in 1914, this has never been done before. It is quite literally the stuff of science fiction. And it's important to remember that in 1914, only the Germans operate Zeppelins. British and the French do not have Zeppelins. They're designing their own airships, but they're not as powerful as Zeppelins. And so it gives the Germans a pretty powerful psychological and potentially even military advantage.
Yeah, and, it's going to be something that we see on the battlefield fairly quickly. Well, I say on the battlefield, in a sense it is, in that it's on the home front, which becomes its own battlefield. But it's going to be something that comes about fairly quickly and is going to reach a peak really in the middle of the war. No doubt we'll cover that as we go through. I think, though, Spence, before we get to that point, for those of us that are maybe listening to this thinking, well, I understand the concept of a Zeppelin, can you tell us a little bit, what does a Zeppelin look like? What's its crew like? How does it move? How is it powered? How does a Zeppelin work?
Great question, because we're all, I think, familiar with photographs of Zeppelins. And if we were to grab you off the street and say, draw us a picture of a Zeppelin, we could probably do a fairly good impression. Zeppelins combine the high technology, really, of the early 1900s with some relatively crude, old-fashioned aspects. They're this sort of halfway house of technology where, on one hand, they're extremely advanced, but on the other hand, they also really pay a lot of tribute to the older Victorian designs of balloons and even sailing ships. Significant that one of the Wright brothers actually says in 1909, he's questioned what's the future going to belong to, Zeppelins or aircraft? And he says, Well, Zeppelins have reached the pinnacle of their design. They're not really going to get much better, whereas aircraft are only just scratching the surface. And there's some truth in that, I think. So the essence of a Zeppelin is it is a very large cylindrical flying machine. As I've said before, it's got a metallic frame with canvas over the top, and it's powered by a series of individual hydrogen cells inside. And it's these hydrogen cells that allow it to become lighter than air and fly. It's powered by a number of engines, and there's various types of Zeppelins during the war, but generally you'll have some engines at the front and you'll have some engines at the back. Now, these are relatively small engines, of course. There's various considerations. The weight that you want to strap onto the Zeppelin is a factor. The fact that the Zeppelin is actually very light once its hydrogen cells are full means you don't actually need that much power to propel it. So you'll usually have engines at the front and the back. You'll also, and this allows you to move in 3 dimensions. You don't just have to move forward in a fixed pattern. You can also side slip effectively or turn and bank. Zeppelins are quite maneuverable, although they're very slow. And indeed, the top speed of a Zeppelin, even when it's carrying a relatively light load, is not going to be much more than between 80 and 100 miles an hour. So in that sense, they're soon to be outclassed by aircraft. The crew operate in cupolas that are fitted underneath. They're underslung the Zeppelin, and this allows you to get in and out fairly easily when you land. That's useful. The front cupola is where it's steered from. There's actually a steersman who is, in the early Zeppelins, he quite literally is operating a ship's wheel to control the rudders. And that's where the idea is that this also has harkening back to the Victorian era in mind. And in fact, part of a standard Zeppelin's crew is a sailmaker, and he's there to repair tears or damage actually in that canvas hull of the Zeppelin. So you've got in some ways echoes of the 19th century as well as the most modern technology. So the front coupler is where it's steered from. That's where you're going to have your captain, your steersman, some other crew. There's also a rear coupler, and this rear coupler is literally an engineering coupler. You have engineers there. They can maintain the engines. They can work on the engines. Moving around the Zeppelin is actually done internally. From the couplers, will be ladders that lead into the interior of the Zeppelin. Zeppelin is not filled with gas. That's a sort of common misconception. It's actually filled with hydrogen cells, and you can move between those cells. You can walk along the gantries, and indeed you can climb from the coupler at the bottom via ladders right to the top of the Zeppelin and emerge out on the top if you have to. So you can move all around it inside. Now, in wartime, it's worth saying that the wartime configuration for Zeppelins are a little bit different from the peacetime configuration. The Zeppelins quite quickly start mounting machine gun positions. You'll have some machine guns in your cupola down below. You'll also have machine gunners on top of the Zeppelin. And when the Zeppelin is going into action, the machine gun teams will climb out of the cupola, through the interior of the Zeppelin, onto a ladder, and then they'll be on top of the Zeppelin. Very exposed position. They actually harness themselves to their machine gun positions with straps and harnesses, and they defend the top of the Zeppelin. Originally, the first Zeppelins don't have that, but it's found that, as we'll get into later, Allied aircraft prefer to attack them from above because they realize there's no machine guns there, so you want some machine gun coverage there. Zeppelins, as I say, come in a variety of configurations. Different designs are introduced during the war, but that's the essence of it. Generally 2 underslung couplers, machine gun positions on top, bombs carried within the couplers and steered above all else from the front coupler. Quite maneuverable, but relatively slow, and also rather vulnerable to wind conditions as well, because these are not especially high-powered machines. If you're traveling against the wind, or if indeed the wind is coming at you laterally, you can be blown around off course. And bear in mind, listeners, that I can't emphasize this enough. We're used to the idea of what we would call strategic bombing. It's been a feature of warfare since the First World War. But in 1914, this is completely unknown. Nobody's ever done it before. It's only ever been speculated on. And so what the Zeppelins are about to do is something really remarkable. But just to finish on life in a Zeppelin or operating in a Zeppelin, it's actually pretty hard. A Zeppelin crew numbers will vary depending on the type of Zeppelin. Lowest crew, you're going to get about 11 men. Larger Zeppelins will have a crew of 20 plus. Those couplers are exposed to the elements. It's cold up there. It's windy up there. It's not a particular, although it's a smooth ride, it's a cold ride. So the crew are going to have to be wrapped up in sheepskins, goggles, scarves, and so forth. If you're operating a machine gun on top of that Zeppelin, you're super exposed up there. It's really, really dangerous. And yes, you're strapped to the Zeppelin, but if the Zeppelin explodes or detonates or is destroyed, you've got to unstrap yourself. Do Zeppelins carry parachutes? Well, this is an interesting element. Zeppelins certainly can carry parachutes, but they're a crude form of parachute. You don't strap it to your back. It's actually strapped to the side of the hull, and you attach yourself to this parachute before you jump out. And then as you jump out of it, the motion of you plummeting will hopefully tear the parachute out of its holder and it'll open. There's no ripcords in this sense. So it's pretty high risk. But one thing to say, and I think this is a really common misconception because we're used to things like the Hindenburg disaster, which is, of course, the 1930s, is Zeppelins don't naturally explode. In fact, Zeppelins in 1914 are pretty survivable because they can take quite a lot of damage. They're very, very big, and they can afford to have some of their hydrogen cells breached. Unless you're then applying fire to it, they won't ignite. The gas will just escape. So bullets alone, not enough to destroy a Zeppelin. Shrapnel can damage a Zeppelin. It's very unlikely to set it on fire. And so if a Zeppelin's damaged like that, it will start losing altitude, but it'll come down relatively slowly. So Zeppelins are actually quite survivable to begin the war, although we do tend to have this vision of them exploding, and of course we'll get into that a little bit later. But I'm not sure I'd have fancied flying in a Zeppelin in 1914, Dan.
No, I mean, you describe it pretty well there. I think the conditions, given the altitude that's employed by some of these Zeppelins up to about 15,000 feet, and you can imagine if pre-pressurization amongst other things, very, very cold, very, very cold weather, and just generally uncomfortable. And these are long flights as well, particularly if you're flying into a headwind. A strong headwind at 15,000 feet might be almost as fast as the top speeds of your Zeppelins. You might actually be going very, very slowly indeed. So, lots of different things to cover there. But I think what you've done there, Spence, as well, is painting a very interesting picture of life inside a Zeppelin, is highlight a couple of things that are really important when it comes to the early story. As you say, not only is it difficult to actually maneuver these things and get them into a position, we're also so early in this new way of warfare that it's actually very difficult to find and attack your target. We're not talking about, of course, it's way pre-radar and anything like that. You're talking about somebody with a map in the air trying to find landmarks and then attack them. And of course, we need to understand what is being attacked, because Zeppelins, it's one thing to fly over the UK and potter around and drop some bombs. What damage are you going to do with that? So actually, amongst other things, it's the industrial targets. So the East End of London, very much like it is in the Second World War, they're great targets to take out with a Zeppelin. But in truth, the real, to my mind at least, the real weapon that Zeppelin inspires, much like we spoke about in our last podcast, I think is fear.
And this is absolutely true. Just to go back to the point I was making, there was a genuine Zeppelin panic in Britain in 1909, 1910. People were seeing ghost Zeppelins over cities. And then in coming into 1915, you're going to get real Zeppelins. And this has just never been experienced before. And people don't really know what a Zeppelin is going to do. They don't know how much firepower it can deliver, how many bombs it can drop, how much it can do. And there's no such thing as civil air defense because nobody's ever needed civil air defense. Nobody's ever been bombed before. Nobody's ever had this before. And for the British public especially, because Britain is an island, it's been spared the hard hand of war, which continental Europe has experienced. Britain has not had hostile foreign armies marching through it since the Norman conquest in 1066. Might have had English and Scottish armies rampaging around, but it's not been invaded by a foreign power. And civilians in Britain have not suffered at the hands of war since the Jacobite Rebellion in the 1740s. It's been incredibly peaceful to actually be a British civilian. Whereas compare and contrast being a European civilian, you've had wars, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, where armies march through your territory and your homes may be destroyed, you may become a refugee. So this is something psychologically the British public is completely unprepared for. And the fear of Zeppelins is elevated because the actual first Zeppelin raids take place on Belgian cities. So Liège gets bombed, Antwerp gets bombed, and it kills about 19 civilians in these combined bombing raids. At the time, the Germans are just throwing artillery shells off the side of a Zeppelin. But back in Britain, those casualty figures are multiplied many times. And there's talk about hundreds of casualties and, it's awful. And the Zeppelins flying low, machine gunning you. People are scared of this and they don't know what to expect. There's no protection for them. This isn't like the Second World War where there's a comprehensive system of air raid shelters, or you may have an Anderson shelter, a homemade air raid shelter in your garden. Nobody's experienced this. And remember too that urban Britain is densely packed. People live in terraced houses very close to each other. The urban sprawl of British industrial cities is quite considerable. So you don't need, for the Germans, they don't need to be very accurate. Drop some bombs in this over a city and you're likely to hit it. So the fear of Zeppelin raids is absolutely enormous. And for the Germans too, you made a point that actually navigating a Zeppelin is very difficult. And it is difficult. This is the dawning of this kind of deep, what we're calling intruder operations, flying into a hostile territory. They're navigating from maps, they're peering out of the cupola. They can be directed by wireless signals from Germany, but these are very unreliable. There's no radar, there's no electronic range finding. You've basically got a compass and a map and you take bearings. Sometimes you navigate by the stars. Very difficult. And so the Germans realized quite quickly they can't use any kind of precision bombing. They're just going to have to attack targets in general. And just one point to make about this, that the Germans actually form an elite Zeppelin unit, which also includes some aircraft who are originally planning to bomb the Channel ports. And they call themselves, it translates as the Ostend Carrier Pigeon Detachment. It's their cover story. And if you're a fan of the old Hanna-Barbera cartoon, Stop the Pigeon with Dick Dastardly and Muttley, I've often wondered whether the name has something to do with that. But the fact that they actually use this name as their cover for what's going to be an elite air squadron tells you something about how new this is. And also, of course, the moral element of it, because the Germans convinced themselves the bombing of Liège and Antwerp, and also the bombing of Warsaw, which comes in 1915, they're actually aiming at military targets. There's fortifications around these cities. That's what they're aiming at. As they begin to plan an actual bombing assault, a blitz, if you will, on Britain, they know then they don't have the ability to specifically target this. And so there is some moral uncertainty about this. But as Alfred von Tirpitz, who's head of the Navy at the time, he summarized this. He says, the measure of success of the bombing attacks will lie not only in the injury, which will be caused to the enemy, but also in the significant effect it will have in diminishing the enemy's determination to prosecute the war. And this is effectively a statement of the purpose of 20th century strategic bombing.
Interesting statement. And I would argue probably a factually incorrect one as well, because when we look at the moral effect that Zeppelins have, not only for civilians at home, but also on the front line. And recall seeing a number of these letters that are written in 1915 and 1916 describing Zeppelin raids at home. They certainly don't have a morale damaging effect as far as I can see. In fact, they harden the resolve, if anything. So, it's an interesting, if you like, early war statement of objectives, and I think probably a flawed one. So lots of interesting things to cover there. So, we've got a good idea about what Zeppelins are planning to do, what they look like, how they're going to work. Of course, Zeppelin raids start fairly early in the war. We'll maybe dive into this in a second. It's also worth pointing out that the shock factor of the early Zeppelins is still enormous. Now, I'll skip forward a little bit to a famous raid in October of 1915. So it is still fairly early in the Zeppelin story, but it gives a great idea of just what the surprise and shock element is. It's the 13th of October, in fact, and it's a raid by a Schüttellands, an SL, which is a wooden airship of the kind. It's the German naval variant. And it's going to arrive in Hertford, which is for anyone familiar with the UK, it's the county town of Hertfordshire, my home county. It's not very big. It's clearly not London, put it that way. Although surprisingly, when the captain of this airship comes back and goes back to Germany, he reports that he's located and dropped bombs on industrial targets in the east of London. In fact, he's not. He's found a much, much smaller town, maybe 20 times smaller, which has a river running through it that looks slightly like the River Thames, except it's about 60 feet wide instead of 500 yards. And what he's going to do, he's actually going to target the town. And a number of about 40 bombs are going to be dropped in and around Hertford on that day. But the very first casualties, believe it or not, are going to be 4 men that come outside of a pub in a place called Bull Plain in Hertford, because there's word that there's a Zeppelin flying around. They're all looking up to see this remarkable thing that nobody's seen before. And surprise, surprise, somebody throws a bomb out of it and it kills those four guys. There are about 12 people killed. In fact, nine killed, and there's a tragic story of a pregnant woman who's killed or dies of her wounds and lose her baby as a result, as part of this. But the shock and the surprise on the residents of Hartford and many other towns and cities throughout the country is absolutely palpable in the days following that. We see it in newspapers. And bear in mind, this is a time of censorship. So it's quite difficult sometimes to actually understand exactly where these take place. Although with the benefit of hindsight, we can generally work it out. But there's absolute shock, there's absolute panic. And I think very significantly, there's absolute outrage as well.
There is. And this goes back to this idea that this is a totally new form of war. It's absolutely new. Nobody's ever done this. This is the deliberate targeting of civilians. Now, the Germans, of course, defend their actions and say, well, we're targeting industrial wartime production. We're targeting factories and armaments industries. Of course, there's no way. There's just the accuracy of bombing at this stage is so poor. There's no way you can get it on target. And they are killing women and children, quite literally, who aren't combatants, who aren't actually involved in the war. And the outrage towards this and the hatred, it has to be said, towards both the Zeppelins themselves and the Germans for launching this type of attack is vicious. And it's completely new. I cannot get this across enough. It's never been seen before. And what adds, I think, to the hatred of this is several things. One, it feels completely random and indiscriminate. And it is indiscriminate in the sense that although the Germans might be aiming or are planning to bomb a factory, they're really dropping their bombs wherever they can see a target. It feels indiscriminate partially because of the limitations of Zeppelins, because Zeppelins, as we've established, if they're going against the wind or they're being moved around by the wind, they can get blown wildly off course. I'm thinking particularly of German Zeppelin L9, which is on a mission to attack London, and somehow it gets blown all the way off course and it attacks Hull instead. Now, those two cities are not close to each other at all. That's how far off course he is. He thinks he's over London, he drops his bombs, actually causes a lot of damage in Hull. But then to the British, it just feels like these attacks are random. You can be hit at any time, you can be struck at any time. And what adds to this horror and outrage is, for a time, despite the best efforts of British defences, there's no answer to Zeppelins. Guns fire at Zeppelins, but they don't really have the elevation to hit them. And as established earlier, Zeppelins are actually quite survivable unless they're hit by incendiaries or explosives. Planes are scrambled to try and engage Zeppelins, but these Zeppelins are attacking at night. The science of night fighting is absolutely non-existent. Very difficult to fly and make a successful intercept at night where you've got no instruments to guide you, you've got no radar, you've got no radio to guide you into target. And also because the Zeppelins are high, the aircraft of 1915 just can't climb fast enough to engage them. And although there's various attempts to do this, it feels as if British public is powerless against this weapon in early 15, certainly, and that you can be bombed and killed in your bed. How outrageous. And as I say, in the 21st century where sadly we've become used to this, we forget how new and how terrifying this was. And there's instances of people having what we would probably now call panic attacks at fear of Zeppelins, and that image of ghost Zeppelins, which had haunted the British mind in 1909, 1910, becomes very prevalent. And there are so many false reports of Zeppelins over the skies of various cities. I wouldn't go as far as say hysteria, but there is certainly a widespread sense of panic, fear, and revulsion. And I think it's captured in the term that starts getting used for Zeppelins, and that's baby killers.
Yeah, and it's, I think, quite often something that's more thought of with relation to things like the Vietnam War. And we'll see in terms of when the first Zeppelins are actually brought down over the UK, just how that spite and hatred actually manifests on the ground. And there is a real and genuine hatred. And it's one of those things. I wonder when we get a bit further into this and we think about the German crews on that side, whether they were aware of the level of hatred that was being developed on the ground. And there's a couple of really controversial moments, in particular, captain by the name of Heinrich Matthew we'll talk about in a few minutes' time, no doubt. But yeah, I mean, huge dislike, hatred, and fear that is put out there. And of course, the immediate real kickback to that is that when Zeppelin raids really do start to mount, and it might be in numbers of 5, 6, 10, or 12 Zeppelins approaching the UK at the same time and making some serious raids, there of course now needs to be a concerted effort. And like everything we talk about in the Great War, really it's combined arms in a sense that's actually going to start doing the damage. Because as you say, Spence, night raids are a real problem. What we do have is we've got some home defense squadrons, number 39 being the most famous, which is based just north of London. They're going to be, in effect, the front line when it comes to knocking down Zeppelins. But they can't do anything if they can't see them. They've got to be up there. They've got to get there first. And so now we need to see things like searchlights working in tandem with aircraft and a very brave pilot getting to the very top of their altitude envelope to even get anywhere near these things.
And this is all so new. Nobody's ever had to do this before in history. Nobody's considered doing it before in history. And so the British response in 1915, as is so often the case, is courageous and it's haphazard. The British military is not well set up for the type of war it's going to fight in 1915. And so all kinds of ideas are suggested for how Zeppelins might be dealt with. How can you engage them? How can you intercept them? And it all has to be done within, of course, the limitations of technology. So you start getting searchlight batteries. But first question is, well, where do you put them? And because Zeppelins seem to be attacking randomly, partially because they're being blown around, it's very difficult. London's an obviously prime target. It's a big area. It's the capital city. That's where the Zeppelins are often aiming for. So you can start to place searchlights on the approaches to London. But then how do you coordinate them with guns and anti-aircraft guns in their absolute infancy here? These are basically converted artillery pieces. And the science of flak barrages, completely unknown. These guns are not firing barrages. They're just firing into the sky. And in fact, the anti-aircraft guns early 1915 probably do as much damage to Britain as they do to Zeppelins, with shells plummeting down and breaking windows, breaking roofs, in some cases killing and injuring people. And then you've got to try and coordinate that with your aircraft. And the idea is searchlights will pin a Zeppelin. And Zeppelins are slow, so if once searchlights found it, it's thought it can stay on it. And that will guide aircraft to attack them. But that's much easier said than done. If a Zeppelin disappears into a cloud or it gains altitude and disappears, the searchlight loses it. And for the pilots as well, flying at night is incredibly dangerous. Flying and taking off and landing at night is probably the most dangerous aspect, but it's just as dangerous for the pilots. And you imagine you're in these relatively crude aircraft of mid-1915, your engines straining as you're trying to get altitude to attack this Zeppelin, which in 1915 feels almost invincible, especially the early part of 1915. It can fly much higher than your aircraft. You can't get at it. Even on occasions where a fighter plane does get near to a Zeppelin, fires a few shots into it, seemingly has no effect, and you're greeted by a fusillade of what we suppose we now call tail gunner fire back. So it's really challenging, and it sets in stage, and we come to this so often on this podcast, a sort of arms race of technology. Can the British and also the Allies develop anti-aircraft methods to engage Zeppelins that will stop them, or can the Germans keep improving their Zeppelins to carry more bombs, have better flight characteristics? And there's this sort of arms race in the skies over Britain, and advantages are won and lost by both sides.
Yeah, I'll go back to something that you said earlier, which I think was really enlightening with regards to that. And basically, Zeppelins have a limit in terms of what they can achieve. Aircraft have a limit as well, but a much higher bar that they could possibly reach. Zeppelins have always got a couple of problems. Zeppelins are never going to be really quick. They're always going to be an enormous target. They're always going to be a pretty highly flammable target as well. So those problems are going to be a big limiting factor. The advantages they've got, as you said at the start of the war, they can fly very high. British aircraft really struggle to get up to that height. Even with the size of a Zeppelin, artillery shells, you're going to do very, very well to do any serious damage there. There are instances of that. In fact, you could argue that the crew themselves are the most vulnerable part to any artillery fire or anti-aircraft fire, we should call it. But there are still concerted efforts made and different methods tried. The first aircraft who do manage to intercept Zeppelins, as you said, they might empty some machine gun into it, big balloon, fairly easy to hit. You stick some rounds through a Lewis gun strapped to the front of your aircraft, it's going to do a bit of damage. It's going to cut a few small holes, maybe leak a bit of gas. You might struggle to keep altitude to a certain extent. In fact, the first real, if you like, effective attacks, and rather unusually, were actually made by bombs. And that's a strange thing to think about, Spence.
It is. The idea that you're going to drop a bomb onto another aircraft. Again, this is stuff of science fiction. It's just never been thought of before. But it's an actual response to the fact that Zeppelins, certainly in 1915, are pretty resilient to machine gun bullets. And they're firing back at you as well. And they can pack quite a lot of machine guns. They can generate a lot more firepower than the fighter aircraft of 1915. As we've said, the experience of fighting Zeppelins, a lot of this actually comes from France, because in France, the Germans actually try some daylight attacks with Zeppelins, and it doesn't really work. The Zeppelins do bomb Paris, but it doesn't really work because to get a Zeppelin in day across the Western Front, you've got to fly over dozens of French airfields, and they'll all scramble their fighters to engage you, and they attack them repeatedly. It doesn't really work. But it's the French who come up with this idea that, well, the best way to actually kill a Zeppelin is not just to shoot into it, because you can riddle it with bullets, and it's not really... It will start to lose altitude, but it will just fly away from you. The best way is to try and set it on fire. Well, how can you do that? There's no incendiary ammunition for aircraft in 1915. You can't do it with a machine gun. So the solution is, well, can you drop bombs on top of it? So this is actually a very challenging activity. You've got to get above the Zeppelin, and bear in mind the Zeppelin has the later Zeppelins certainly have top defense. Some of the early Zeppelins don't, but later Zeppelins have got machine gun teams on top who are going to be shooting at you. And then there's no bomb sights. In some cases, for the early aircraft, you literally have to throw a bomb out of the side of your cockpit and hope it hits the top of the Zeppelin. The only way to do that with absolute certainty is to be really close to the Zeppelin. But if you're really close to the Zeppelin, those machine guns are going to be shooting at you as well. So it's actually really high risk, very daring, requires nerves of steel, a really good eye for dropping your bombs, and a little bit of luck as well.
Yeah, when you consider it, there is, I suppose, a bit like the story of U-boats in the Second World War. There's a period of time where Zeppelins are, in a sense, untouchable. Maybe not quite untouchable, but certainly they've got the run of play. They hold all the aces, and things need to change. And it's really in September 1916 that they eventually do. And this is going to be with the invention of a new weapon, not necessarily a weapon, but a new type of ammunition, which is going to really change the scene in a big way. This is, I'm not going to go into super detail because I don't know super detail about it, but I can tell you the name of it and broadly what it does. This is a type of ammunition called Brock Pomroy. More specifically, it's actually two types of ammunition. So we've got named after the two inventors, or the two guys that look at this type of ammunition. It's in effect mixed bullets, and what we're talking about is a tracer, a type of tracer with an incendiary or explosive incendiary charge. And in effect, what we're going to find now is that at a certain range, these bullets that fired, if you can get the range right, they're going to go bang, and they're going to cause a flame and a small explosion at a certain range. Now, if you combine this with firing a great big bag full of cells of gas, you can see where it's going. Up until the time of really September 1916, there's not a hell of a lot you can do with gunfire against a Zeppelin. Now, on the 3rd of September 1916, there's a man by the name of William Leaf Robinson of the famous number 39 Home Defence Squadron, who's based, I think, somewhere around Northolt, so on the north side of London. He is going to be in the air. Bear in mind, the speeds of aircraft and Zeppelins are not hugely dissimilar. Aircraft are a bit quicker at the time, but if they're a long way away, you've really got to struggle to catch up with them and get there. He's actually going to be in the air, and he's going to be seeing a Zeppelin SO-11. It's not a Zeppelin, actually. It's a Schuttlands, once again. SO-11, wooden framed, that is somewhere in the northern area of London, and it's been illuminated by searchlights. Number 2 searchlight detachment from Barnet, who become quite famous as a result of this. And they are going to manage to lock on to this airship, and they're going to hold it in their sights for a period of time, which allows Leif Robinson to locate it and start climbing for all he's worth to try and catch up with this airship. Eventually, he's going to get within range. He's got in his Lewis gun armed on the front of his aircraft, of course, with the famous interrupter gear. He's going to be pouring fire into the Schuttlands, and he approaches from slightly behind, slightly below, and he knows the range he's got to fire at in order for those rounds to explode within the center of the Zeppelin. The enemy captain, a guy by the name of Wilhelm Schramm, sees it. There's some return fire. He's also desperately trying to gain height, Schramm, because he knows that's really his best friend at this time. And what Leif Robinson managed to do, I think it's his third and final drum of Lewis gun Brock Pomroy ammunition. Finally, I wish I had the description with me at the moment, but he talks about just emptying this entire magazine right into the rear bottom of this Zeppelin, and he says it seems to have no effect. But then all of a sudden, from the inside, I see a small glow. And he says within seconds, this thing just ignites and comes flaming down to earth at a very, very high rate of speed. It's absolutely shocking. And it's watched on the ground by literally thousands of people. Wild cheers go up in the street, such as the passion that people have in watching this. And remember, it's a wooden framed aircraft. This SL-11 comes plummeting down to earth and really starts burning, lands just behind a pub in a little village called Cuffley in Hertfordshire. The entire crew are killed. Rather horrific death, but this is a real turning point in the war. And it's something else to point out here. I don't know. I maybe sound a little disingenuous with it. Leif Robinson gets a Victoria Cross as a result of this. It's impressive. Absolutely, what he does is really impressive. He's also the first guy to be firing explosive ammunition at a great big bag of gas. Wonder if later in the war that would have been VC worthy. I don't know, but it's certainly what he achieves and the effect that it has is certainly VC worthy, and it becomes really an instant celebrity overnight.
He does, and absolutely famous figure. I actually collect First World War postcards from all combatant nations. Every man needs a hobby. That's one of mine. And I have a copy of a postcard that's produced in the aftermath. There were several postcards that were produced in the aftermath of this. And you have pictures of Leif Robinson. You send this to your friends. Look at Leif Robinson. He's a hero. Beautiful illustration. But there's also another one that's it's quite collectible, actually. And it is a propaganda postcard. And it's showing the German Zeppelin SL-11 going down in flames, illuminated by searchlights with Leif Robinson's aircraft in the distance. And it's captioned, "The End of the Baby Killers." There's not a lot of mercy for the German crew, who, of course, are all killed in this shoot-down attempt. But it's not actually the first British shoot-down of a Zeppelin, but it's the first British shoot-down of a Zeppelin that's occurred over the British Isles and has been seen by lots of people because they're watching this. They're watching the Zeppelin explode. They're watching the searchlights track it down. This is an incredibly visual victory, and it makes Leif Robinson an absolute overnight celebrity. Thousands of people come and visit the wreckage of the airship that's been shot down. And actually, they sell off parts of this wreckage to raise money for the Red Cross. You can still occasionally at collectors' fairs find pieces of the airship that have been in family collections for a while and then get sold off. He gets awarded the Victoria Cross at Windsor Castle. There's unbelievable crowds come to see him. He's awarded thousands of pounds. He's an absolute incredible celebrity. And he's proven that this use of incendiary bullets in close attack will work. It's worth just saying a little bit about what happens to Leif Robinson after this, because he subsequently he goes out and he actually fights in France. And during Bloody April in 1917, he gets shot down in battle by Jaster 11, which is the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen's squadron. And Leif Robinson shot down. He's actually kept as a prisoner. He tries several times to escape. He fails each time, badly treated in prison. Gets repatriated at the end of the war in December and almost immediately contracts Spanish flu and dies, which I think is a sort of sad end for what at the time was one of the most famous pilots in all of Britain. But just before we sort of move on from Leif Robinson, I really want to highlight a hero who's been completely forgotten. I'm a British fighter hero, and this is Reginald Warneford. And Reginald Warneford's a British fighter pilot. He's actually in the Royal Naval Air Service, and he destroys a Zeppelin, destroys LZ-37, but he's actually fighting it over Calais. And so it's not seen by the British public. And Warneford's able to get above this Zeppelin, which it may have been partially damaged, may have been losing altitude. He's able to get above it in an incredibly crude aircraft called a Moraine Parasol. a French fighter aircraft, and he's able to get really close to it and drop some very, very small bombs on top of it. They weigh about 20 pounds each, these bombs, setting on fire, destroying it. It plummets down. And there's actually a story about the crew here, because all but one of the crew are killed. The survivor of the crew is actually the steersman, a guy called Alfred Muller. The cupola is detached from the burning Zeppelin about 600 feet above the ground, and he's in it. He hasn't had time to parachute. He's just clinging onto it. Must have been terrifying. This Zeppelin crashes into a convent, and he's in the cupola. The cupola hits the roof of this convent. He's catapulted out of the cupola, flies through the hole in the roof, and lands in a bed in the convent, and he survives. He's the only survivor of the crew. That man was clearly not fated to die in that. But Warford shoots down the Zeppelin. He wins the Victoria Cross for this, but his celebrity is nowhere near Warford's because it just hasn't been seen over... Warford's celebrity is nowhere near the same as Leif Robinson's because it's not been seen over Britain. And actually, he doesn't live very long to enjoy this success. His victory over the Zeppelin is... the success of it is very short-lived. He shoots it down on the 7th of June. By the 17th of June, he's dead. He dies in a flying accident. He's taking an American journalist on a flight in his aircraft, and the wing breaks off, and they plummet to the ground and they crash, and they're both killed. So he's sort of forgotten, but he's also a VC winner against Zeppelins. And the fact that I think VCs are given for this, one, because it's very new. Nobody's done this before. And secondly, because, as Leif Robinson says, it's actually quite dangerous and daring. You're very close to this Zeppelin, it's shooting back at you. It's pretty nerve-wracking stuff. You need nerves of steel to get that close.
Really do. And just a quick word on Warford, actually. I was in a place called Brompton Cemetery in London recently, which, if anybody knows, is very close to Stamford Bridge, Chelsea football ground. Some fascinating characters buried in there. Many, many great stories, particularly related to the First World War, actually. One of the people buried in there is Rex Warneford. He's actually got a Zeppelin on his headstone, which I don't think I've ever seen with anybody else. So he's got a kind of civilian headstone with a Zeppelin on it. So a rather unusual thing to cover there. But, we should remember that really it's Leif Robinson, I think, marks the changing tide. What Warneford does is amazing, but Leif Robinson proves that there is a new way to shoot down Zeppelins. And actually, really, the period from about September to the end of October 1916 is, in U-boat terms, the closing of the gap mid-Atlantic, because it's at this point now where if you're in a Zeppelin, and you're spotted by an aircraft, you've got a pretty high chance of getting shot down. And in fact, surprisingly, it's only a mile away from where Schramm gets shot down in September. That not the next one, but the next one after that gets shot down. We're talking about L-31. This is a true Zeppelin, by the way, not a Schuttlands, not a wooden frame construction airship. This is a true Zeppelin, L-31. And it's incredible for several reasons. One of them, which absolutely blows my mind, is the captain of this airship. So L-31 is captained by a man by the name of Heinrich Mathy. Now, Heinrich Mathy, believe it or not, is born and raised in London. To German parents, his father works at the Siemens factory, which is in Charlton in East London. And Mathy is born and raised in London. No proof of this, but there's a story that he speaks with a Cockney accent. He goes back in the end, or just prior to the First World War. He then becomes a Zeppelin pilot, a Zeppelin captain, and he's going to use his knowledge of growing up in and around London to come back and be a very successful captain, dropping bombs on that same city. This is incredible stuff. He actually finds himself back aiming for London again in October of 1916, and he's going to be attacked by somebody whose name I think is most famous from the Second World War aircraft that is given honorifically in his name, and that's a man by the name of Woolston Tempest. Now, Tempest is going to have to go to a height of 15,000 feet. He's also, we should say, he's a comrade of Leif Robinson in the same squadron based at the same airfield. He's going to go to 15,000 feet, very much like Leif Robinson did, trying to track a Zeppelin that is basically been caught in searchlight beams. One of the problems that Tempest gets is his fuel pump breaks slightly after takeoff. Despite that, he's going to manually pump fuel into his engine, plus doing all the other stuff he's got to do for 2 hours. Absolutely incredible what he achieves. He is going to eventually get close to to Matthew, who is going to be at the same time, trying to get that height, trying to also drop bombs. He's around North London area. Tempest actually reaches him, does exactly what Leif Robinson has done. He pumps Brock Pomroy ammunition straight into the gas cells, sets this Zeppelin alight, and it starts coming down. It's going to crash at a place called Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire. Now, there's a really, I think, a thing that we can't overlook here, tragic in some ways and understandable in others. The famous decision that Zeppelin crews have got to make, and that many of them talk about actually before anything goes wrong. It's a classic thing that's taught back at bases like Wilhelmshaven and things like that in Germany. What are you going to do if your Zeppelin sets alight? And this is a big question, because in truth, whilst parachutes are a possibility, they're very, very hard to use, particularly with an explosive loss of your aircraft. Impossible, in fact. And this is exactly what happens with Matthew and his crew, because, and we can even see this in the records of the time, British government come out post crash, and what they're going to do is plot the location of the bodies that are found of the individuals, because the entire crew are going to perish, and they're found in a straight line about every 200 meters. Now, to understand why that happens, basically, as the fire reaches the part of the Zeppelin that they're in, these men are faced a choice: burn to death or fall to your death. And they're pretty much all going to take that second choice. And they're going to jump out of an aircraft without a parachute as it's going down towards the ground. The very last man, very famously, is Matthew himself. And one of the most powerful things, Spence, I find about this is that Matthew was probably quite low in altitude by the time he jumps. What he's done is he's taken a big, thick woolen scarf and comforter, and he's wrapped it around his head, presumably to try and soften the blow. And there's a story as L-31 crashes into the ground at Potter's Bar, into an oak tree, in fact, which comes known as the Zeppelin oak, that Matthew is found hammered into the ground in soft turf. There's actually a photograph taken of the imprint of him once his body's been removed, showing where he's hit the ground. There's a suggestion that he may live for a few seconds. There's no proof of this, but it does go to show that these guys, given these options, burn or die, and they really are the only two options, many of them are taking that second one.
It's grim stuff. I mean, the consequences of being in a burning Zeppelin are almost certainly fatal. And certainly, prior to this podcast, I had a really good look through all my sources and information to find examples of Zeppelin crews parachuting out of burning or damaged Zeppelins. And in all my research, I was able to find one example of what a successful parachute, which we'll come on to in a little bit. There's various reasons it's difficult. Once the Zeppelin starts to catch fire and explode, it's terrifying to be in the coupler. It's absolutely terrifying. You've got this huge explosion, heat, the sense of collapse. Very quickly, the coupler will be at a very awkward angle. You'll be descending extremely rapidly. It's very difficult. The wind is howling against you. There's a natural inclination to be panicked and afraid. And then, as we've said before, these parachutes are not strapped to your back and jump out. You actually have to attach yourself to them and then jump over the side. That's fine if you're in level flight, but if your coupler is plummeting to the ground and you're at a 45 or 60 degree nosedive, that's really difficult. And so a grisly end, and the fatality rate on Zeppelins is absolutely enormous. In terms of machines lost and the fatalities associated with them, it might just be the deadliest arm of service that the Germans have. U-boats are pretty close, but Zeppelins are, once a Zeppelin explodes, the chances of survival are absolutely minimal. And of course, if you're a top gunner, you've got no chance of getting away. You don't have a parachute up there. You're doomed. So you can imagine the strain it must put on the Zeppelin crews, because as I think we've made clear, there's this sort of technological battle between Zeppelins, and once the British have incendiary rounds, the chances of making a successful raid on Britain and getting away intact decrease dramatically for German Zeppelins. And so every time they're going out to bomb and raid, whereas in early 1915, they can do it. Yes, it's dangerous because you can be blown off course and things, but you can do it basically with impunity. Chances of being intercepted are very low in early 15. Well, that's not the case by 1916. Now, any Zeppelin entering British airspace is at high risk of being attacked and destroyed. And so there's this sort of ongoing arms battle between Zeppelins and aircraft that goes on right through 1916 and into 1917.
Yeah, and I think going back briefly to the morale component of this that we spoke about, in 1914, German air chiefs talking about how they're going to be able to damage the morale of British public at home and also the willingness to fight. I think really by the time we get to the end of 1916, we do see a damage in morale, but it's absolutely not the British morale. It's the morale of German Zeppelin crews. To the extent that same night, the L-31 Matthews Zeppelin is brought down, L-24, which is part of the same raid, the crews see L-31 go up a few miles ahead of them, and they turn tail and run as quick as they can. They're going nowhere near that location. In fact, they end up dropping their bombs on a little village by the name of William, kill a single man on the ground of the Royal Defence Corps, a guy called Private William Hawkes, buried just down the road from where I live right now. And what's interesting is that Hawks is actually operating a night landing ground, which is designed in parts to try and draw Zeppelin fire. Ironically, doing exactly what we were supposed to do. And there are bombs dropped on this night landing grounds. The commander of L-24 sees L-31 go up, thinks, I'm not going anywhere near that, turns around, jettisons his bombs on the nearest target he can find, kills Private Hawks, and disappears off. Interestingly, my local museum, or one just down the road from me now, one of the main things they had, it's disappeared in the years post-war, but one of the prized possessions was a German cloth cap from an airman from that Zeppelin that was found in a hedge after the raid, presumably by somebody that had leaned out to deliver a bomb and lost his cap in the process. But it's really worth pointing out, the morale component here from the end of 1916, October onwards, the heyday of the Zeppelin raids. It's really done, Spence.
It is, and the Germans try and respond with technical improvements to their Zeppelins. You get a slightly different Zeppelin class, particularly the P class, which is that's the sort of the workhorse of 1915, but it's struggling by late 15. Gets superseded by the so-called Q class, which can fly even higher. So the idea is going to get really hard to intercept it. There's various improvements, small improvements to Zeppelins. They start painting their bellies black so that they can't be spotted from the ground so easily. Normally the standard colors are sort of off-white. They paint them black so it's harder to be picked up. They try and fly higher so that it's much harder for interceptors to reach them. Carry more machine guns, or in some cases fewer machine guns, so that you can actually get higher up. If you're at the stage where you're being attacked by aircraft and you need all your machine guns, the Germans say, well, that's a dangerous position to be in. Now there's incendiary ammunition. Made a bit of a difference when they were trying to drop bombs on Zeppelins, but not now. There's other little technical improvements. There's improvements to bomb aiming. Bombs start getting actually dropped electronically rather than just kicked out of a bomb bay. Various improvements, but really the Zeppelin has lost its technological edge by 1916. The Germans will actually start moving towards using very heavy bomber aircraft, the so-called Gothas or the Giants that start attacking Britain in 1917. Fascinating subject for another podcast. But the Zeppelins continue their best efforts, particularly German naval Zeppelins, and they're being driven on by the head of the German naval airship fleet, a really intense man called Peter Strasser, who has got, I think, elements of the bomber barons of 1940, of the Second World War about him. He's driven, and he's a believer in Zeppelins. He accompanies he flies his own Zeppelin into action a number of times. And he's just determined that the bombing will continue, even though the Zeppelins through 16 and 17, whether they're flying higher, whether they're more advanced designs, they're still dropping bombs on Britain, but the risk of entering British airspace now as a Zeppelin is getting increasingly high. And the Kaiser himself, actually, in the summer of 1917, even though German aircraft are bombing London, Kaiser actually briefly forbids German Zeppelins to attack, although he relents. As often the Kaiser does, he comes up with an idea, implements it, then changes it. But the actual success rate of Zeppelins just declines and declines and declines, and raid after raid is just losing Zeppelins, or at least, even if they're not being destroyed, they're getting badly damaged and then they're limping back home, and sometimes crashing in France or crashing in the North Sea. It's it's clearly the damage they're inflicting, the casualties they're inflicting are not worth the casualties they're taking in return. And increasingly, the Germans start to rely on aircraft to carry out these bombing raids instead.
Yeah, and I think that balance of kind of, if you like, cost versus reward is really what spells the doom of the Zeppelin service in that sense, because Gothas are much harder to shoot down. They can deliver a pretty significant payload. They're scalable in numbers, speeds are coming up. There's a lot more potential with them than Zeppelins, which have, I think, reached their highest altitude. In fact, they're descending, if you enjoy the analogy at this point, really from those peaks of 1915, 1916. And the story of Zeppelins, and bear in mind they're big crews at this point as well. It's a big coup if that crew is lost to a man. And there's still that hatred. That hatred never goes away. There's still that hatred on the ground. One example of this, actually going back to October 1916, is the burial of the crew of L-31, who ironically get buried in the same little village cemetery, village churchyard that SL-11's crew are buried in, a place called Potter's Bar. And the entire funeral procession is egged. So people are throwing rotten eggs at the funeral cortege as it comes through. There's an enormous police presence that has to be placed there to keep the crowds back, who are screaming things like "baby killers" as this crew are buried. I mean, the vitriol and the hatred is through the roof. But really, by 1918, Spence, there's no other options really. It's the last hurrah for not only for the German army on the Western Front, but of course for the Zeppelin branch as a whole. And you mentioned Peter Strasser here. He's maybe a good way to round up the story, because perhaps his personal story is really quite emblematic of the Zeppelin service as a whole.
It is, and just to add some weight to this, there's Zeppelins are used less and less through 1917. It's just too risky to actually use them in bombing, especially when there's more effective aircraft to do it. They're still used for reconnaissance, especially naval reconnaissance. But really, through 17 and 18, the story of Zeppelins is they're getting hunted by increasingly technologically advanced aircraft. It goes back to that point I made right at the start that one of the Wright brothers said, I think 1909, aircraft have still got a long way to go. Zeppelins have reached their peak. And I think you see that in the war. It doesn't matter if the Zeppelin can fly higher. Now the aircraft can fly higher. It doesn't matter if you put more machine guns on the Zeppelin. Well, the aircraft can fly through those. And two things I think really capture the sort of the end of the Zeppelins, the decline of the Zeppelins, and their sort of fate. One is in August 1917, something quite remarkable when you consider that powered flight had only just started at the beginning of the 20th century. A fighter aircraft, it's actually a Sopwith Pup, a small biplane, is launched from a British warship, HMS Yarmouth, and it becomes the first aircraft to shoot down another aircraft, or in this case a Zeppelin, after being launched from a warship. And the chap who's flying it is a guy called Bernard Smart. He takes off in this relatively small fighter aircraft, intercepts a Zeppelin over the North Sea, engages it, actually shoots it down. And even though he's being shot at, they've got a lot of air defense on this Zeppelin. And I have to read out his account because I think it's one of the most dramatic accounts of engaging a Zeppelin. And he remembers he's going into action against him. It's about 6:30 in the morning. He's doing about 110 miles an hour, rushing in on this Zeppelin. And he remembered, I could see a man and an object unpleasantly like a machine gun on top of the envelope. And I now realized the time had come. I was now at 7,000 feet, and the Zeppelin 1,000 feet below me at an angle of 45 degrees. I was heading straight for her stern. I pushed forward the control stick and dived. The speed indicator went up with a rush to 150 miles an hour, and I was aiming to cut under the Zeppelin a few yards astern of her. The roar of the engine had increased to a shrill scream while the wires were whistling and screeching. In an awful manner, I completely lost my head. The earth vanished, the sky vanished, the sea was no more. My universe consisted of that great round silvery object, myself and space. Everything then happened automatically. At 250 yards, and at the same height as the Zeppelin, I flattened out slightly and pulled the lever which works the fixed machine guns. I'd misjudged the angle at which this was mounted on the plane and saw the white stream of my incendiary bullets going too high. In a flash, I had nosed down again, flattened out and rammed down the machine gun's operating lever. Held it there. The gun spat out, and though the machine was wobbling on account of the enormous speed, I had just time to see about half a dozen rounds enter the blunt end of the Zeppelin and a spurt of flame before my very soul froze with the thought that in my eagerness to aim the gun, I'd waited too long and couldn't avoid a collision. Spasmodically, I jammed the joystick hand forward, and my heart seemed to come into my mouth in the absolute vertical nosedive that followed. He had, of course, set the Zeppelin on fire, destroyed it. He was able to return. He's obviously a wordsmith as well. That's quite the dramatic account of this. But it gives you some idea about actually attacking a Zeppelin's quite a challenging thing in a biplane. But you're at the stage where Zeppelins are being hunted. They're being attacked by very large British flying boats if they can engage them. And now they're being attacked by planes launched from ships. Technological arms races. Really, it's been lost by the Zeppelins by 1918. And to bring this back to Peter Strasser, he's in the very last raid, Zeppelin Raid of the War, on the 5th of August. He's leading his beloved airship fleet, and he's returning back across the North Sea during daylight. And he gets intercepted by a two-seater, it's actually a bomber airplane, a DH-4, chases him down. It's being flown by Major Egbert Cadbury. If you've ever had a Cadbury's chocolate bar, he's one of the Cadbury family. He engages Strasser's airship, he shoots it down in flames, and Strasser's airship is destroyed, lost with all hands. And so Strasser himself, the head, the commander of the German airship fleet, the main instigator of the bombing campaigns, the man who believed most passionately in this, he's eventually killed and shot down by a biplane. And I think that really captures something about, ultimately, aircraft have triumphed over Zeppelins.
Yeah, I think it really does encapsulate that idea. And I suppose to round off the idea of Zeppelins generally, it's really, for me at least, a story of two halves, because there's absolutely no doubt about it that the Zeppelin threat of the First World War and the early successes of 1915, 1916, they herald, of course, the start of a new type of warfare, which is, as you've mentioned several times, ever present to this day, and perhaps most famously going to be over the same cities again in 1940, 1941. But ultimately, what we find is that the threat that Zeppelins pose diminishes. The damage that they cause diminishes. There is something in the region, I believe, about 500 on the ground deaths in Britain in the First World War, and it's another one of those weapons that, whilst it's intrinsically linked with the story of the Great War, it's certainly not a war winner. Although it's not something that we should forget. It's a story that does need to be told, and a remarkable one in many ways. Because living in the UK, as we both do, Spence, I know you're not a million miles away from a place called Cannock Chase, which is a German cemetery, actually, predominantly a Second World War German cemetery, and quite often it's easy to forget that the history of the Great War is to be found in the UK as well. And if anybody is in the UK and wants to go and visit somewhere with some fascinating history, I would suggest going to Cannock Chase German Cemetery, because buried in a separate little plot are actually 4 crews of Zeppelins who were shot down in the Great War in the UK. So it's SO-11, L-31, and then 2 others, Sowerby's. Sowerby's one, which I think comes down at Billericay, and one other I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment. But all 4 of those crews are later repatriated into Cannock Chase, and they're the story of a weapon which started the war with a huge amount of promise and ended the war really quite literally defeated.
I think you made a great point there, Dan, about it introduces a new form of warfare. It made this clear at the start of the podcast. Nobody has ever carried out what is now called strategic bombing of a city before. It's just not been possible. And Zeppelins start this. And although the Zeppelins are mastered, and in the end it becomes, I won't go so far as to say almost a suicide mission to fly into British airspace, it becomes incredibly dangerous for Zeppelins to do so. But in that early part, when the British do not have effective responses to Zeppelins, these weapons are terrifying. They're absolutely terrifying. People have not experienced this before. The randomness of the attacks, the violence of the attacks, the idea of being killed at home in your bed far away from the front line is outrageous. The hatred, as we've discussed, towards Zeppelin crews too, because of this, is vast. And the overall effectiveness of Zeppelins militarily in their bombing campaign, very limited, but they do kill, as you say, Dan, about 550 people, injure perhaps 3 times that many, cause substantial property damage, and there's some arguments that they actually do, certainly in 1915, affect British wartime production, that workers are frightened and disrupted by this. we can only really guess at this. We don't really have the statistics for it. But I think perhaps the biggest story is they open a Pandora's box, that they've established that it is possible. Whether it's acceptable is another question, but they've certainly established that it is possible to carry out aerial raids on civilian areas and potentially have an effect. And we've mentioned several times in this, the Germans moved towards heavy bombers instead. That's another story instead that deserves its own podcast episode. But in a way, the Zeppelins open up a 100 years of warfare that we're still living with now, where unfortunately civilians, even hundreds of miles from the front line, are at risk of air attack. And I think that's perhaps the biggest legacy of the Zeppelins of the First World War.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Nice one. Thought that was really good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that one. I think my stomach started rumbling about 45 minutes in. So sorry, Linus, if you're picking that up on the mic, but it was quite loud.